Hey everyone, and welcome at another episode of the Global AI Notes. Just as every week, we're inviting another guest to talk about anything to do with AI. So, again, welcome. Looking forward to learn more today about large language models with LangChain. And today we invited another guest, and I'm welcoming Cameron. Hey Cameron, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you, Sammy?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here on the live stream again today. Cameron, can you please introduce yourself to the public?
So I'm Cameron Vetter. I'm out of the United States in the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area, and I've been kind of working within the Microsoft tool chain for about 25 years professionally, and kind of shifted over about 15 years ago to really focus on Microsoft Azure. And then that kind of led me into AI. About 7 or 8 years ago, I kind of pivoted towards AI after a slight detour into the mixed reality space. But I've been doing AI ever since and really focused in on Azure machine learning. I've been focused on the cognitive services, cognitive search, and now OpenAI plays a very big part in my day-to-day consulting as well.
So, you are a principal architect for the moment for the company you're working for. What is your
Yes.
day-to-day work then?
My day-to-day work is typically one part strategic, where I'm helping companies kind of figure out what they do and what they should do. For example, one company has decided they really need to dig into AI. That's a client of mine. So we're working on developing a roadmap for what 2024 will look like, and kind of where they can strategically retarget towards AI. But then I also help with the tactical, as far as figuring out how to actually execute on roadmaps and how to move forward in some of these strategic directions. So I go all the way from the very strategic all the way to the very tactical, writing code and everywhere in between.
Okay, sounds quite interesting to do that as a day-to-day job. Now, enough about you, Cameron. You will talk today about LangChain. Um, Quick introduction. What is LangChain? One sentence.
Oh, wow, that's tricky. LangChain, I'll just read my first slide here. It's a framework for solving real problems with large language models. So it's a great way of actually making practical use of a large language model. Once you get past the hello world and start to try to solve real enterprise problems, that's where LangChain comes in.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to share your screen. If the public has any questions, please make use of the chat functionalities on the platform that you're watching. And then I will interrupt Cameron with the questions, or we will use them at the end of his presentation. Cameron, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So before I start, I just want to toss out there that, like any good presenter these days, I've been lulled into making my own art using DALL-E and Midjourney. So for this particular presentation, all the art is DALL-E 2. And just wanted to toss that out there. And so some explanation to the logo for LangChain is a parrot and holding a chain. So that's kind of why you'll see that theme throughout the presentation. LangChain is something I got introduced to about 5 or 6 years ago, 5 or 6 months ago, by somebody internal at Microsoft, kind of showing me kind of where they thought things were going. And so I dug into it, and I found myself using it day to day in so many problems, and kind of helping me get, like I said earlier, get from that hello world kind of proof of concept to something that's really ready for the enterprise and kind of solving the more complicated problems. So I'm super excited about it, and I've found myself actually a contributor numerous times already to the LangChain project, along with many others. And so here's this presentation is kind of meant to be a practical introduction and kind of why you should use it and what's going on with it. So let me dig in. So I want to kind of focus in on four key areas here as I'm talking. And the first one is the need. So, what is the reason that you would actually want to use LangChain? We've kind of alluded to that already. What are some of the features? How do you get started? And then how do you kind of navigate? So, those are the four key areas that I'm going to dig into here. Um, so why do we need it? So the why we need it is because there's this illusion that LLMs are easy, and I blame ChatGPT for this. So with ChatGPT, anyone and even their mother, their non-technical, whoever friend in their life is going out there and they're using ChatGPT and they're getting these amazing results, right? They're digging in there, they're typing out a prompt, and they're getting shockingly good answers. And so everyone's kind of got this illusion right now that LLMs are easy, at least a lot of the clients that I talk to. Well, the truth is it's not. It's really not easy. And once you get past that really lightweight use case, it starts getting very, very complicated. And so here's the six areas that I feel are the big complicated ones. So the first is integration. So how do we integrate with tooling so that the LLM can use that tooling? How do I have my large language model go get some data out of SQL Server, for example, or something along those lines? So how do I make that integration? How do I interface into my large language model? Right? It's really easy when I'm sitting in a chat box in ChatGPT, but what happens when I want to write some code and have the code actually get the large language model to do something and then be able to process the results coming out of there? So how do I interface with it? Um, the not so secret of large language models are hallucinations. So when a large language model gives you an answer, it is just as likely to completely make something up and present it with absolute confidence as it is to present you with an 100% accurate result. And in fact, the results are a little bit disturbing when you see how often it just makes something up or part of the answer up. So, how do you deal with that? And then, kind of along those same lines, when I take a look at the data that's in my business domain, how do I get the large language model to answer questions based on that data and not just answers out of its general knowledge that it's acquired while it was being trained? Next is these more complex scenarios. So once you get past hello world, once you get past typing are you going to take over the world large language model and gain a funny answer out of it, and start getting into really complicated scenarios, how do you put that all together, and what does that story look like? And finally, how do you get this all into production once you've solved all these problems? And so those are some of the problems that I see with large language models and that most people are not talking about. Too often I see developers kind of diving in there and saying, "Oh, this is easy." They do a quick proof of concept, sometimes in a couple hours, and say, "Well, we've got it." And kind of proceed with absolute confidence without realizing all of these uh, road bumps that they're going to hit along the way. So that brings us to the need for LangChain. And so the biggest thing that I feel like I get, and this is the architect in me speaking, is I get a framework, and that framework makes it really easy to plug in all of these different components. And what comes along with that is some design patterns. So LangChain has established the LangChain expression language for defining chains, but more than that, they've also defined all of these interfaces. Whoops, sorry about that. They've defined all of these interfaces for how we plug different things into the LangChain framework. So having all of those design patterns established for you is really nice, and going into a framework is really great. So often I will read something on Reddit, for example. They'll say LangChain is useless. LangChain just gets in the way. LangChain complicates things, and see people talking about how I'll just build this myself. I'll build all of these pieces myself, and they certainly will. And You can always reinvent it here, but what you always get in the end is another thing that you have to maintain, all this additional complexity, and you miss out on everything that's being pushed into the open source world. So this is moving forward. Typically, they release on a daily basis. There is a new package that comes out. So all of that you're missing out on if you try and invent all of this yourself. So to me as an architect, it provides me the framework that I'm going to plug into in the design patterns that I will use in my project. So what's in a chain? So, it's called LangChain because it's really all about chaining different components together to kind of tell the entire story of what you want your large language model to do. Because so often we look at it as, if I go and hit the OpenAI SDK directly, I can easily send it, make a couple lines of Python code, send it a request, and get a response back. And so it seems like this is really simple. So why would I want this framework around it? Well, because in reality, when you start to do a more complex solution, what you find that you'll be doing is you'll chain multiple different models together and feed the input of one into or the output of one into the input of another. You might have some sources that aren't AI, they aren't language models. I brought up SQL Server before. So how do I fit SQL Server into there? So ultimately, you end up with a chain of tools. And to give you an example from one of my current projects, what started as simply working against GPT-4 is now a 14-step chain to get the complete solution. But what I've baked into there is I baked in all sorts of um, knowledge that I've baked in. I've baked in numerous models. I've baked in connections to vector databases and all of that sort of stuff. And so LangChain gave me the framework to actually put that all together. So typically what we find in a chain is we will find a prompt. So we're kind of mostly familiar with prompts is the thing that I go and I type into ChatGPT. But what LangChain will help you do is form up a much more sophisticated and complex prompt where the prompt can take variables and other inputs into the prompt beyond just being a fixed thing. They've got baked in loaders and transformers. So the loaders are for loading data from a particular data source. Say I've got a pile of hundreds of PDFs. Well, I can use the PDF loader and a transformer to split those PDFs apart and process that and get it ready to be used by my large language model. Typically, every chain is going to have some form of language model. And I've talked only about OpenAI so far, and that's because that's kind of the big model that I find myself working with is GPT-4 and 3.5. But LangChain can work with just about any model that's out there. A lot of people are using Llama, for example, and many other models off of Hugging Face. So pick your language model or set of language models and plug those in. We also have the concept of tools. So tools are very aligned with what we think of as plugins in the ChatGPT world. So these are things that know how to go do one little thing. They know how to go query SQL Server. They know how to go out and dig into some other source of information. Go get something off the web, make a RESTful API call, whatever it needs to be. What you basically can do is build your tools or use tools that plug in, and the large language models then have access to those. And finally, we have integration with data stores. So where is the data coming from? In reality, when we get to more complex scenarios, we almost always have some form of data that we're going to put out there and we're going to want to consume. We're going to want to use it to ground our model. So, in the concept of grounding, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is to give it some kind of base of information that it's going to generate its answer based off of, so that we can prevent hallucinations and also detect hallucinations when they happen. So all of those things typically fit into a real production scenario. And so that's why it's really helpful to have something like LangChain that helps you assemble all of those things together. Um, so the other thing that we get is we get integrations, and there are literally hundreds of integrations, and I'm going to click over to the website real quick just to demonstrate that. Um, what you can see here is all of the different things, and these are kind of organized by providers. But let's say that I wanted a vector store. You'll notice along the line here, we've got probably 30 or 40 different vector stores. So what's really nice is somebody has taken the trouble of building the plugin, and oftentimes, as you'll see later when I start doing demos, these things actually plug in with only a few lines of code, making it really, really easy to be able to consume and use these things. Um, so all these different integrations really are a big benefit of using something like LangChain. So what are the key features of LangChain? So what does it bring to the table? I kind of told the story of why I would want LangChain, but what are the features that it brings to the table? So I think the best way to kind of talk about this is to give an example. So when I work with a large language model, oftentimes I will use a vector database. And I use the vector database to give the large language model a way of interacting with my data and a way of searching within that data and finding things that I then can use to ground my answer that I get from the large language model. And so in this example, um, I've got some swappable components that I want to talk about here, and I'm going to look at Pinecone to start. Pinecone is a very popular vector database. And so there's a plugin within the namespace of LangChain, and you can see we've got langchain.vectorstores.pinecone exists. And so I can import that in, initialize my connection to Pinecone, and then tell it that I want to work within documents. So basically, 2 lines of Python code. I've told it how to connect to my Pinecone database and how to actually obtain information out of that database. Then that lets me use a standard interface in this case to do a similarity search. So in this case, the question I wanted to ask is, how do I find the support phone number? And I'm saying here, give me the 3 best results and do a similarity search. So a similarity search means that from a vector search perspective, what is the closest 3 results? So the 3 things that are the most similar to that particular question within the vector database. So now I've got this, and I've been able to do this in just a couple lines of code because I'm using the Pinecone plugin for LangChain, and I'm plugging it into my chain. So now imagine that I said to myself, well, Microsoft has now got an Azure Cognitive Search capability to do vector search as well. So let me switch to that instead. So it's just as simple as switching to that plugin, the Azure Search plugin. And you'll see in this case, it's 1 line of code after I import that in that both initializes it and tells it how to access information. And then I can do the exact same similarity search. So what we've got is we've got this interface over the concept of vector searching. And now I can plug that into my larger LangChain so that I'm able to then work with that vector search and use that as part of my large language model chain that I'm going to do for my production scenario. Um, so that's a big feature and kind of an example of how LangChain works. And the other really interesting thing that LangChain brings to the table is the concept of chains and agents. So an agent is something that's out there and able to actually go do some unit of work, and it does that with a chain. And so I've got 6 examples of ones that are baked in. So with LangChain, there's a bunch of baked in chains that are there and ready for your consumption. And those are the ones that are really easy to get going on. But in addition to that, I can go and bake my own chain, or I can inherit from these and kind of build my own functionality on top of that, which is often what we find ourselves doing. But so the six examples that I've got here is we've got a conversational chain. So this is very much what the use case that most people think of that they're going to do with their large language model. They're going to carry on a conversation with the large language model and go back and forth with it. Other things, another chain is the retrieval one. And this is what I was alluding to in the previous one. So this is when I want to basically chat with a vector database. I want to say, vector database, do you know the answer to this? And then have my large language model take that information and form it up into a nice answer. So that's kind of a question and answer type of scenario. There's another one that's focused on solving math problems. Large language models are notoriously bad at solving math problems, but Python is great at it. So the large language model for math actually combines a large language model with Python libraries for performing math, brings those two together to kind of bring that capability into your large language model. And it goes on and on. We've got the large language model checker. So that's a chain for questioning and answering with self-verification. The NatBot specializes in driving a web browser, so going out and using the web. And QA with sources, so a chain that specializes in doing that question and answer scenario, but then cites its sources of where it got the information from. So there's many more than this, but the point that I'm getting at here is we've got these pre-baked chains that are already made for us in LangChain. So doing something like this is just a few lines of code, as we'll see when I do a demo in a couple minutes here. And it makes it really easy to get going and to solve some of those boilerplate use cases and do it in a production ready manner. But then I can also extend these or build on top of this framework to add my own chain and create my own functionality and do something that's unique to my particular problem in my enterprise. So here is an example of actually doing a large language model chain. So this is the very kind of simplest example that I could think of that was actually useful. So this is that I want to build a chatbot and I want that chatbot to have some memory so that we can have a discussion and not just have one back and forth. And I want to get those responses back in something that I can consume. So in this case, it'll be JSON that comes back. So this chunk of code is pretty much everything that's necessary to do this. So first, I start out by forming up a prompt. And in this case, I'm saying you are a nice chatbot having a conversation with a human. But you'll notice that I also add a placeholder for a chat history. And that's where the memory gets injected back in on every call to the large language model so that it has some history. And then I also have a place where it injects in the question. And we'll see what this looks like when I run it in just a second. But this is kind of the scenario that people are doing with ChatGPT, right? This is the most basic scenario. And so to do this, I'm actually going to build out some memory. So we have something called a conversation buffer memory. And this keeps track of the history of the chat so that that can be consumed by the large language model for each iteration of the conversation. Because when you interact with something like using OpenAI as an example again, when I interact with GPT, it knows everything that I give it in that interaction. It doesn't have any history beyond that. Um, so then what I'm going to do is form up a chain. So I'm going to form up a chain. I'm going to say use an OpenAI large language model, and that's a little bit hidden behind this call. It's going to feed in that prompt, use that memory, and I'm going to do it in a verbose manner. Then I'm going to make a call and say hi, which will initiate the conversation. So this chunk of code with LangChain is all that I need to do to create that complete chatbot experience. And so here's what the execution looks like. It would start out, and this is kind of what would go to the console. It would start out by saying, you are a nice chatbot. etc. Then the human would say hi, and then the AI would respond and say, how can I assist you today? Now imagine we did another iteration and said, translate this sentence from English to French. I love programming. And then that's where the chain would finish. So the result that you would actually get back would be a JSON document that would have the original question as well as the text of the answer. And in this case, the large language model not only answered the question, but it kind of put some nice language around it. Sure, the translation of "I love programming" from English to French is something in French I can't pronounce. And so that's kind of an example of how easy we can do that basic use case when we use LangChain. And certainly you could do some of this stuff yourself. You know, if I go back here, I could certainly make that call directly to OpenAI myself and send it a prompt with a question and get a response back. But the complexity then of managing the memory to feed back and keep the history of that conversation is fairly complicated, and all of that is being done for me by the LangChain framework. um, so how do we get started with LangChain? And maybe before I continue, I noticed there's some traffic in the chat. Sammy, is there any questions I should pause to answer here?
There were a couple of questions which I've already answered on. It was someone who was asking linked to Neo4j if there was a data store feature for it, and then someone who was asking how did LangChain have something in common with AI? So that you can also answer on it again if you want.
Got it.
So for
Yes.
Neo4j, I found there was a data store, so I've shared that with you.
Yeah, there definitely is. That's a very popular one actually used with the LangChain framework. And as for how this fits into AI, so this isn't actually an artificial intelligence. This is a framework that wraps other AI models and other components to help plug them all together to create that enterprise caliber solution. But it's designed for working with other AI models that come from other places, like OpenAI or the Llama models or Hugging Face or some of those places. All right, then let me continue. So, uh, part three here is kind of talking about how do we get started with LangChain. So, you know, I told you a little bit about it. I told you why I get excited about it and why I use it in all of my large language uh, projects at this point. So, how do I get started as a new user? And for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to actually sit here and code in real time. But what I would like to do is give you the resources of the places that I think are really great places to start. Um, so first of all, there's the quick start page. Um, so this is on the LangChain website, and what they've got is kind of this quick start. And this is the I'm new to the framework. I want to do something and just see how it works and do that hello world type of problem. And so there's instructions on how to get it installed and set up in your Python environment, and then how to build an application with a large language model, how to feed in a prompt, and how to properly use an output parser. And those are all kind of things we did in my example. Is there was an output parser that was magically working behind the scenes that took that output from that large language model and turned it into that JSON body so that it's something that I can easily consume by my application. So if you get done with this quick start, you basically will feed a prompt into a large language model and have the output parsed. So this is a great place to get started. But what I really want to draw your attention to is actually down here at the bottom, um, the next steps section. So you can pretty quickly go through that quick start, but what's really interesting is to start to explore off of these next steps. We've got some use cases and explanations of how to consume them. And notice that up on the top bar, they think this is so important that they have the use cases as its own menu item. So you can dive into there, as well as learning about the expression language, learning about the key components. So this is kind of the really great place to get started, and to get going with LangChain. So from there, the next place that I would recommend that you move to is taking a look at those use cases that I mentioned before. So, we've got the documentation up here, and there's all sorts of great ones. If I want to learn how to do that chatbot that we just talked about, here's a great example. Here's the use case, and here's the explanation of how it works. So that's all fantastic. But the thing that I want to highlight to you is if you go into the source code itself, in GitHub and take a look at LangChain docs. Under extras, there's all these Python notebooks that go along with these use cases. So if I want to take a look at the Python notebook that goes along with the chatbot, here's the Python notebook of something that actually works that I can just go and start playing with right away. So oftentimes when I find myself exploring a new use case within LangChain, I will go find the Python notebook that goes along with it, and I'll get it running on my machine and start playing with it and experiment. Because for me, I'm kind of hands-on learner, but we all learn differently, and this is a great place to do that. And there are a ton of great use cases in here in Python notebooks. For example, imagine that you want to do some web scraping. This is one I've not looked at. But we've got the use case, we've got the overview and some code and some examples of kind of how to get going down this path. Um, so I find this really helpful, and it's helpful in two ways. It provides me with inspiration, so starting to think a little bit bigger about what you can really do with these large language models, because there's a lot more to it than just simply having a funny chat conversation with ChatGPT. There's a lot that we can accomplish with these. And so by going into these Python notebooks, you kind of get that in the back of your head, and it will help you map out things that you can do within your business domain. At least that's where it helps me a lot. Um, so next, I would point you to the overall documentation that goes along with this. So the documentation is updated as often daily, as the library itself. And there is a ton of information in here. So when you get to dig more deeply into this, for example, if we want to look at that memory that we were looking at before that I was using in an LLM chain, we can see here's the conversation buffer memory. So I can dig through the documentation, or I can go to the actual API reference and see what's going on here. So I'd encourage you to kind of look through that as well. But these are kind of the resources that helped me get going. And because we're looking at Python and it's open source, it's really easy to just go step through the code as your program is running. So these are all the resources that I found really helpful as ways of being able to kind of dig in and get started. But I really encourage you to start out with that quick start and start exploring from there. And finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is navigating complexity with LangChain. Um, and this is kind of one of the things I highlight as what you really get out of it. So when I look at what I do with LangChain as a framework, is I try and uh, use the design patterns to kind of guide the way that I'm shaping my projects. And so one of the ways that I kind of address things is I find there's things I need to do that aren't completely covered in LangChain. Is I extend the functionality I will inherit from functionality that's already there and build something new on top of it. And often, if I feel like it's something that would be beneficial to the community, I'll contribute it back. But I don't think it's essential necessarily that everything you build on top of it, you contribute back. But I do think it's useful to build it within the design patterns that are there, because it really helps to give you that framework for plugging your stuff in and for kind of shaping what the architecture of your solution is going to look like. And the other big thing is, how do I productionalize that? And this goes back way before I was working with large language models, when I was just in there with TensorFlow or with PyTorch, building my own neural networks. It's really easy to build the model, well, relatively, but then how do you productionalize it? How do you make it something real? How do you make it something that can go and handle 100 calls in 5 seconds, right? How do you deal with that? It can get really complex, and there's some situations that are pretty unique to machine learning models. The very first one I would point out is how often you get these long running machine learning models, right? I've got some that take up to 30 seconds to complete. And so, how do you deal with that? What does that look like? We're not talking about something that's going to return in 10 milliseconds like you would normally aim for. So, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the models that you're consuming? So, if I'm working against OpenAI's models and I go too fast, I'm going to get a 409, which means too busy, try again later. So, how do I deal with that? How do I bake in the fault tolerance when these things or many other things happen? And how do I do monitoring? So, all of these concepts are baked into LangChain already. So, it deals with that 409 and doing the retry automatically. It helps you navigate the long running, it helps build that fault tolerance, and it gives you a way to monitor and inject your own code to do the monitoring that you need to do in a production environment. So, this is a really important thing that I think a lot of people kind of forget about when they get really excited about their new AI model that they're going to work with. Is they build these solutions, but they haven't really thought through what it looks like in production. And I think starting with LangChain kind of takes you a step in that right direction. And so, when I'm going to actually stand this up somewhere in the cloud or wherever I'm going to, I need to find a way of serving not just one request, but many requests, right? And so there's numerous different solutions that are out there. So I've listed 6 of them here. But what's interesting about these 6 is all 6 of these have integrations into LangChain. So you can integrate them together. So if I decide that where I want to serve up my large language model is inside of RayServe, if I've built that with LangChain already, there's guidance out there on how I plug that in and how I turn that into a productionalized, scalable, reliable service. And so there's these 6 are the big ones, but there's other ones that are always in motion. And there's actually examples of probably 20 or 30 out there in the GitHub repo as well. So, in summary, we talked about the need, or why I feel there's a need for LangChains and frameworks like LangChain. We talked about some of the features, at least the ones that get me excited, but there's a lot more there. In 30 minutes, I could only scratch the surface here. Talked about how I would suggest you get started, and then how you navigate complexity by using LangChain. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. Here's my contact information, but if there's any questions, love to answer some.
Thank you so much, Cameron, for this nice introduction into LangChain. How we can really see it's a tool to help us use LLMs and on an enterprise level, of course. There's no questions extra anymore, so we'll keep it with that. People are saying thank you, and we love to see more development in the LangChain modules, of course. Cameron, you personally been working also on the LangChain library, right?
Yes, I've contributed to new features going in. I helped a bit with both reviewing it before it went in, the integration to Azure Cognitive Services, as well as fixing some of the issues that were in the initial integration there, as well as a few other bugs that I've been contributing to. But I've also got a couple things that I'm working on that I will be PRing into the project. But to answer the question that was put out there, so where would I like to see more development in LangChain? So that there's actually a platform that the owner of this project has been working on called LangSmith, which is kind of a framework where you can do monitoring, troubleshooting, and testing of your large language models. I'd love to see that get from the beta test phase into being productionalized. But the other thing I'd really like to see with LangChain is I'd like to see some focus on stabilization and on really bringing some reliability. What we're seeing right now, because the project is really young and there's so many people contributing, that oftentimes the unit tests aren't being created, and some of the rigor isn't going into the nightly builds that I would love to see there. So I'd really love to see some more test suites get developed and integrated in that are kind of making sure that this becomes a more and more stable platform that is really hardened, and we're not regressing as with each release that comes out.
Well, I think that's a nice bridge also to our next week session, where we'll have Sarah Young, who will discuss why securing AI is not what you think. And I think specifically with large language models, to, for example, making sure it doesn't give any other information than what you want to give. I think that's going to be a very interesting session to follow also. So, with that, will be the end of the episode. But if you want to stay up to date with the latest events that we're organizing, then subscribe here. Go to globalai.community, click on join the community. So you will also get our latest newsletters with our weekly newsletter, which has like all the new things that have been developed in the AI world, but also all the events that we're organizing. So Cameron, thank you very much for joining us today. We thank you for the time and the effort you did in preparing this presentation. I'm looking forward to also more work that you're doing on LangChain, for example, but also on other community projects. So with that,
Thanks,
we will
Sammy.
end our show, and we thank you all for joining and hope to see you all next week. Bye-bye.